agenda item 4 is to be recorded by Hansard. Agreed? Apologies from Leslie Cree. Members aware of any other apologies?
Only Ian McCrae for lateness, I think.
Okay. Draft pages 5 to 10. Members content their record. Agreed. Matters arising, table requests, pages 12 to 17. That's for noting. Moving then to the first evidence session, the review into the operation of the Barnett formula from Professor David Hild. Morning, Professor. You're very welcome.
Morning. Morning.
Can I refer members to the following documents in your packs? There's a bio note at page 18, terms of reference page 19, and the preparation sheet at pages 4 to 5. Professor, would you wish to make some opening comments to the committee, and then we'll move straight to questions and answers?
Thank you very much, Chair and Committee. I very much welcome your inquiry. I think it's very good timing to have that inquiry. My view is that the UK is in a constitutional mess. In many ways, the Scottish referendum settled very little. If anything, the political narrative in Scotland is that though the yes side lost the vote, they won the argument and they won the narrative. It's not at all clear what the present position is. There is the commitment to maintain Barnett, but it's not at all clear what Barnett means to people. Whether it means existing Scottish public expenditure, and particularly relatives, or it means the kind of mechanism of a block grant with adjustments. The other issue which I think is very important is that there's widespread misunderstanding or misrepresentation of the question of the likely tax reforms in Scotland. The Permanent Secretary of the UK Treasury said that Scotland will become the third most fiscally decentralised, most fiscally powerful sub-central unit in OECD. Now, you've got to be very careful because people tend to have a habit of saying, Scotland, the Scottish Parliament actually has been financed by 40%. 40% of its expenditure is notionally financed by revenues raised in Scotland. But the crucial point is that figure is actually meaningless if you've got no policy control over the taxes. So one of the issues that is really important is whether if you've got taxes, you can actually use them without penalty. A very good example of the difficulties that we will face is that the Scottish Parliament, with every member of the Scottish Parliament voting in favour of it, replaced the rather ludicrous stamp duty land tax slab rate system with a graduated land building transactions tax. And admirably, the Scottish Government did it on a revenue neutral basis. And this was going to come in on the 1st of April 2015. So what does the UK government do? It actually, in the autumn statement, actually reforms stamp duty land tax on a non-revenue neutral basis, costing the UK Exchequer £800 million, which it can get from some other taxes, and has actually completely sabotaged the attempt by the Scottish Government to have a revenue neutral system. So I think that the kind of one's got to be very careful that if you've got tax powers, you actually can use those tax powers. I argued to a Westminster committee last year that the only way you can actually have a properly devolved fiscal system with extensive tax powers is if Westminster actually itself changes. It's ludicrous that the UK has its budget in March for implementation in April. You need to bring the UK budget back to about November and actually unable to have coordination. The other point, going back to my kind of previous point, what I forgot to mention is that the Scottish Parliament will actually have to pay the administrative costs of the Scottish income tax. So you actually pay for the system, even if the system is by the political context actually impossible to use. My final introductory point is I've been watching your proceedings on the recordings, and I think what the committee has to think about is whether the problem with Barnett is it gives you too much money, and hence you do not do the reforms which you might otherwise have done because there's too much money around, or whether you're worried about convergence, which unquestionably seems to have been happening in Northern Ireland because of the Barnett mechanism, which is actually putting pressure on Northern Ireland spending. And so I think the committee has to think very clearly through what it regards the problem as being. And obviously, I'm not sure, I only have newspaper reports of your proceedings in the chamber yesterday, but if one is going to start paying for welfare costs out of the existing block, clearly that's going to intensify the pressure on education, health and other services.
Thank you, Professor. Obviously, you've alluded to it, we are in the midst of great potential constitutional change, and certainly in terms of Barnett, there was obviously a promise or an assurance that Barnett would continue in the midst of the Scottish referendum. Is Barnett sustainable? And with the Westminster elections coming up, a lot of people are saying it looks like a possible Labour SNP administration. Is Barnett sustainable in its current form, and is it sustainable in the longer term, or with the flux that you refer to in terms of the potential transfer of fiscal powers in terms of income tax and so on and so forth, does that make the Barnett formula unsustainable in its current form?
I gave the Barnett formula its name in 1980, so I've been around this issue a rather long time. Barnett gets criticised on good grounds, but also much criticised on bad grounds. There are advantages of having a system like Barnett, and of course before Barnett there was Goshen from the 1880s. The UK is a rather strange creature, with 84% of the population living in England and 16% living in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And that rules out conventional federalism, as one knows from countries like the United States, Canada or Australia. The reason why Barnett has survived, in my view, is it gave advantages to both sides. It gave advantages to originally to the Secretaries of State and then to the devolved parliaments and assemblies, because it allowed them to take local decisions on the mix of spending. The expenditure switching direction that's been enjoyed in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland is, I think, immensely important. One of the great benefits of that. It keeps the Treasury off your patch in terms of saying, we like this expenditure, we don't like that kind of expenditure. So it's important from that point of view. It's also prevented specific Treasury raids because it doesn't, on the devolved administrations, because it doesn't like particular policies, like tuition fees in Scotland or free personal care. It also has a big advantage from the Treasury, which, though from outside it can seem an all-powerful organisation, it is a pretty lightly staffed organisation. So the Treasury really only has to worry about what happens in England, knowing that you just apply a multiplier, so that if you've got a cost of X for a policy change in England, you can work out pretty quickly what the effect will be in the UK as a whole. The big problem is that there were things that could have been done to ease criticism of Barnett during the 2000s, when there was basically too much money coming down the Barnett pipeline. And the reason there was too much money coming down the Barnett pipeline, ending up in end-year flexibility, some of which eventually was cancelled in 2010, was that the Labour government identified health and education in England as seriously underfunded, and that produced the formula consequences. And the difficulty was for Scotland with the Tartan tax, that if Scotland actually used that advantageous position to actually use the Tartan tax downwards, it was frightened because of the lack of transparency about how Barnett operated. The Treasury would just penalise them. So the fear, the constraint against using the Tartan tax when there was too much money around was in fact the fear that there would be a retaliation, that the system was so secretive and there would be no way that at the time it would be immediately obvious to the public or to parliamentarians what is going to happen. In terms of Barnett in the future, what has actually happened about Barnet is it started off as a pretty simple system, which the committee knows depends on changes in comparable English expenditure. But it became more complicated over time because Barnet is very much embedded in UK public expenditure control. So that from having a single block, one got the separation between resource DEL and capital DEL, which became important in the 2000s because of the question of the deficit and debt limits. More recently, there's become the financial transactions capital DEL. The attraction of which is, from the Treasury point of view, is that it's actually outside public sector net investment and doesn't count towards public sector net borrowing. So it's a classic kind of arbitrage of the system. So one of the things that could have been done in the 2000s was to review the position of Wales. Now, my view is that when England constitutes 40% of the population, the only way that such a system is going to have any stability is if there's reasonable common interests between Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. The minute you lose the common interest between Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, everybody becomes more vulnerable. And it's interesting how Wales has increasingly been in a position of criticising Scotland. Where there were things that could have been done, I proposed in 2002 in an Institute for Public Policy Research how you could actually put a floor under convergence. If you've got a broad idea of what would be too much convergence, you could actually manipulate the formula quite simply, quite transparently, and actually put a floor there. And that would have eased a lot of Welsh concerns at the time, but that was never done. The other complication that's coming on Barnet, of course, is something that you're familiar with about the block grant adjustments. You've had this in the context. This in the context of possible corporation tax devolution. Scotland's had it in the context of originally the Calman income tax, the stamp duty land tax abolition in Scotland. And so on. So the question is how you revalue, how you calculate the original adjustment, and then how you revalue that in future years. One of the things that one's got to be very careful about is that one can easily get a big transfer of risk to the devolved administrations. Now, the question about how much risk within a single state you should transfer to the sub-national units is a complicated point. But there's a lot of hypocrisy about all this. I live in a part of Scotland which is highly prosperous in the northeast. And Aberdeenshire Council, which is not where I live, but the next council, has got one of the fastest growing populations in the United Kingdom. If you go to the west of Scotland and take Inverclyde, which is basically Greenock and Port Glasgow, that's got significant population loss. Now, to claim that Aberdeenshire is doing well solely because Aberdeenshire is extremely competent and nothing to do with North Sea oil, and that Inverclyde is doing badly because of its incompetence, not because of the decline of industry in the west of Scotland, is pretty preposterous. So there is an important question of how much policy risk you actually wish to transfer. And although it's reasonable to say that at the level of a political unit, of a nation state, you have to balance your budget and worry about your debt. In all countries, there's massive fiscal transfers within countries. And if you start saying that smaller and smaller units, geographical units, have to balance their budget, you're going to start getting into really very serious equity problems and very serious problems in terms of intensifying local recessions when you get public spending cuts matching the loss of tax revenues in small areas. So the answer to your question about Barnet has been remarkably sustained in the past. One of the reasons for that is everybody can not like Barnet, but then you have to start thinking about what the alternative would be. The standard alternative has been a needs assessment, and I've got published views that say that in time I thought there would be a needs assessment. Paradoxically, this is probably becoming more difficult to do than people anticipated because of what's been happening in English local government. long-standing principles of equalisation in English local government have just basically been abandoned in the last 5 years. So one of the arguments has been that you could base a UK-wide needs assessment using the kind of pillars that's done for health needs assessment and for local government assessment. If you look at the hits that the industrial areas of England have taken and the cities have taken, they are really quite remarkable. And within 5 years, a long-standing tradition that the funding available for local public services wouldn't depend on local prosperity has been very seriously eroded. So, the UK needs some kind of mechanism. If the UK is going to survive as a political unit, it needs some kind of territorial mechanism. The UK is an extremely centralised country. For a country of its size, it's remarkably centralised, and England is itself exceptionally centralised. So a very significant problem is actually how you manage England. And the fact that regional devolution in England is off the agenda for a pretty long generation has implications. So my answer to sum up that argument, yes, I think that something like Barnet will survive, but to survive, it's got to be much more transparent than it has actually been in the past. I've seen reference in your papers to the question of the lack of openness about fiscal data. I've always been very impressed by the Department of Finance and Personnel, which I think does a very good job on behalf of Northern Ireland. And I can see that when things were going well, there was an argument for letting DFP quietly negotiate with the Treasury. I think it's got to the point now that one actually has to have far more in the public domain in the form of a proper annual report of what the position is on Barnet, so that there is not the unseen Treasury discretion.
I mean, just on that point, Professor, it is an issue of some concern and some debate here in terms of what financial data the Assembly does receive. And obviously with the transfer of corporation tax, there's also the argument now, yes, you're going to get the benefits of corporation tax if the rate is reduced, but if that increases income tax revenues, if it reduces welfare payments, there's no assurance that that will come through the system and back to the Department of Finance and Personnel in Belfast. So how much more can be done to make that data transparent in terms of the fiscal flows between here and West?
An awful lot could be done. The question is whether there is the political will to do it. My guess is that it depends on this Assembly and this committee and its counterparts in Scotland and Wales to actually press for that, because it won't come without pressure. The system is remarkably untransparent. That is the reason there is so much misunderstanding of how it works. I'm astonished at the number of times I see the 1981 figures for Barnet of 10,585 quoted, even though they've been redundant for more than 20 years. So the lack of understanding how it's done. In 2005, I published a paper in the journal Regional Studies explaining how Barnet worked and actually having, through freedom of information requests to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, actually showing the numbers behind the formula. So you can get an explanation of how the formula works, but there's been great reluctance to put the numbers in the public domain. I do not know what this committee itself gets. I have systematically obtained things from each of the devolved administrations, so I can try to put together an update of my 2005 paper. So the answer is yes, you could. Information is power. In a fiscally centralised country, the Treasury doesn't want to relax that power. The second part of your question about corporation tax, I would urge the Assembly, the Executive, and the Committee to be very cautious about corporation tax. I say that because, frankly, I think that the Assembly and Executive have been led up the garden path by the UK government. When I produced a report on on Northern Ireland funding in 2003 for the Northern Ireland Economic Council, a study that was partially financed by DFP. That was one of the things that was running, the devolution of corporation tax. This is a saga which keeps running, and I don't think it's any accident we've got a draft bill because there's a UK election coming May. The other reason why I think it's running is that it destabilises Scotland. Kind of very clearly, there were several potential difficulties of corporation tax devolution. One of them would be issue of state aids with the European Commission, and also if you can well imagine that if Northern Ireland has devolved corporation tax, Scotland will want it as well. The danger for Northern Ireland is you get an awful lot of brass plates. The experience in terms of the exploitation by companies of corporation tax. I was at a very vivid presentation about Dublin, where basically boards fly into Dublin with a couple of local directors, so you can actually claim that board decisions are taken in Dublin. So there'll be a good industry for brass plates. Also, I suspect a lot of subsequent argument confronted by very expensive lawyers and about whether one is actually breaking rules. The other thing, before I come to the specifics, the other point that has changed is the climate about corporation tax has changed. The kind of until 2008 financial crisis, OECD governments were pretty complacent about what was happening in corporation tax. Now they've got pretty frightened. If you look at the work that Margaret Hodge of the Public Accounts Committee has done, and the revelations, for example, about Luxembourg, and you will know about the double Irish procedure, whereby it's not the lower rate of corporation tax that's paid; it's virtually very, very little corporation tax is paid. So I think so that's the general background of that. The other point is that it's a question of working out what the loss of revenue is, what the loss of corporation tax revenue is. And the fact that you're going to take a upfront hit, then you've got to wait for time for higher corporation tax revenues. It's actually, I'm an accountant by profession, and where companies make profits is often a matter of sophistry. So you can imagine the kind of difficulty with Northern Ireland being well integrated in the UK economy. It would be really quite difficult to know what profits are made in Northern Ireland. We can imagine difficulties there. And then having decided what the regional deduction is, how is that deduction revalued? How is that abatement revalued through time? And as you said, this comes back to the point of if you've got one tax, but the effect of a reduction in that tax, if you believe there will be a big effect, will come through other taxes, raises the point that you made. I do not see the Treasury allowing an abatement because they're getting more income tax and more VAT. So I think that this is I can understand the desire to grow the private sector in Northern Ireland, but I think one's got to be very careful about the long-term legal disputes that might arise about what will happen in terms of how the block grant is adjusted in future years and what the hit on that is. So I think this is a matter for great caution, and you need to make sure that Northern Ireland has sufficient resources to actually argue with the Treasury. And if the system was more transparent, it would be much easier for people like myself and other commentators on the matter to actually engage in disputes with the Treasury about how this works.
Okay, Martin.
Thank you, Professor Hield. Some of my colleagues are going to pick up on corporation tax, but you can be sure we will approach it with great caution. You were complimenting the Department of Finance and Personnel here. We think that's because there's a great chair of the committee. Some people think it's because there's a great minister. But we will be looking at this with an abundance of caution, I believe they say. But, you know, we're only interested in this because we want to create more jobs. The thing with brass plates is really the Dublin financial services centre, but you can't really argue with the fact that there are 10 of the 12 biggest pharma companies in the world are south of the border. So, but we realise the pros and cons. Wanted to ask you about a different thing. You mentioned common interest, and some of us really feel this common interest less than we ever felt it because of this drive against public services, so-called debt reduction, austerity and so on. And Barnet certainly is coming under pressure. You mentioned at the start overfunded by Barnet, but you went on to talk about convergence, and I wanted to ask you in relation to a top-up mechanism. You touched on it. What would that, or what could that look like in the time ahead? And then secondly, you also talked about an alternative to Barnet. What could be an alternative to Barnet?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by top-up mechanism. If you mean funds as well as Barnet.
Well, you used the word top-up mechanism during your discussion, and yes, that's exactly what we mean. Funds is you're saying that Barnet no longer is fit for purpose, or may not be fit for purpose if it doesn't. Well, if it doesn't give us enough money, basically, to serve the need that we have. How do we have a top-up mechanism?
Well, but this goes back to the question I raised earlier, of whether the problem with Barnet is actually it gives you too much money and not enough. You're saying your view is that it doesn't give enough money. I suspect that's not the Treasury view. Barnet at the margin has always been flexible. You've got your reinvestment and reform initiative. There's been various things have actually gone on as well as Barnet. What Barnet has done is give a kind of degree of protection because there were these informal, non-constitutional, null statutory rules about how it should run. On balance, I think the Treasury has played it reasonably honestly. Not everybody agrees, but you can always point to the Olympics, and you can also point to the Carter Review of Prisons. But over the kind of post-devolution period, I think they've actually played it. They've played it reasonably honestly. So Barnet gives a structure. The point I was making is that Barnet is getting more complicated because it's embedded in UK public expenditure systems. It gets the more internal interior divisions that impede local flexibility. You've got to be very careful about these top-up mechanisms, because if you do get corporation tax, and do actually want to use it, you're going to have to convince the European Court of Justice in due course that there is a proper hard budget constraint associated with it. Now, there was a time when whenever Tony Blair and Gordon Brown came to Belfast, I guessed that there was some Barnet Plus thing going to be done. The big issue in Northern Ireland is about whether you're willing to use the revenue-raising powers that you've got. That's the big issue. Now, the property taxation in Northern Ireland is lower than it is in Great Britain. That's one issue. I don't want to get into the issue of water charges because I know it's extremely controversial here in south of the border. But that is another issue. So the question about mobilising resources. The really depressing thing about the Scottish referendum campaign and the aftermath is we want more powers. We have very little idea what we're going to use the powers for, except that we want to cut taxes, and we want to increase spending. And it's this dissonance between those two positions that is something that one has to seriously concentrate on. I think, in answer to your question about Barnet is sustainable, I thought my pre-referendum assumption was if the vote was no, the name Barnet would go, but something like Barnet would stay. That you get a different name, but not Barnet. But basically, the idea would be the same. It would be an adjustment mechanism driven by what happened in the biggest country in the Union. Now I think it's more likely that the name Barnet will stay, but one will end up with something completely different that actually operates differently. And this goes back to the opening comments of the chair. about, I think that this inquiry by the committee is really important, because I think you have to start thinking these issues further forward, because things are moving very quickly, with a remarkable degree of misunderstandings in Scotland of what the issues are. I mean, the kind of, you know, the whole thing in Scotland now is more powers mean we can do something about inequality. At the same time, we're going to cut taxes, and we are going to the Scottish Parliament welfare devolution in Scotland seems to mean having higher benefits than in England, which the question of how those are financed is something that people don't address.
Sure, I'm going to let you move on. One of the great mysteries of Barnet, Professor Heald, is that, and you talk about going back to the 80s when devolution appeared here, the sewage system didn't work. We still didn't have a dual carriageway to our second biggest city in the north. We were totally under catered for in all types of infrastructure. We've been under pressure since, so I don't know what they're going to replace it with, but it hasn't been. It certainly hasn't been a magical formula for us or a panacea. We always felt we were underfunded. You did refer to the word, but you could be overfunded. I didn't think we were underfunded at all. I didn't think we were overfunded at all when I look at the state of state of many of the services we were bequeathed to us in devolution.
Right. Okay. Just to clarify a point I made earlier, what I said in the 2000s is that huge amounts of money came down the Barnet pipeline to involved administrations and in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland because of English health and education increases. The timing of that wasn't very good because, in fact, people couldn't spend it wisely. If you suddenly get more money, you've actually got to get the real resources. You've got to get the teachers and nurses and capital projects in place. So and because of fear that eventually the Treasury would cancel the end year flexibility, led to some pretty unwise decisions, certainly in Scotland. So I wasn't really talking about. I was talking about timing. The money came fast, beyond the capacity to actually spend the money sensibly. On the point about because of Northern Ireland's political history, there was very significant infrastructure neglect in Northern Ireland, and I would accept that, and that's why, provided one does it openly and transparently, there's nothing necessarily wrong about Barnet. There's nothing necessarily wrong about Barnet Plus. That Barnet's giving an anchor, and then you argue about specific issues beyond that.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Adrian, did you want to pick up on any points, sir?
Yeah, just given that the devolution of corporation taxes on what do you see the Barnet's part in that there, and how do you, the potential, the implications to develop Barnet into a different formula? Thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, what corporation tax devolution would do is take a chunk out of the existing block grant. And the question then becomes of how that deduction is indexed in future years. That's the really big technical issue, and it's also a question of how much risk is involved. Because frankly, we don't know. If you go back to 2006-07, Gordon Brown was boasting that the UK had 54 consecutive quarters of economic growth, and going back into a pretty old history about whether that happened before. No one really anticipated. Very few people anticipated the hit was going to come in 2007-08, and hence once you lock in a deduction with a set of rules about how that reduction is indexed through time, you've actually got a significant deduction from the block. The issue about what the alternative to Barnet is, the much canvassed alternative has been actually to either replace Barnet by a needs assessment. The view, possibly contrary to this assembly and this committee, would probably be that Northern Ireland was overfunded and will actually come out relatively badly from a needs assessment. Nobody actually knows what the result would be, but certainly there have been examples of applying English formula to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland with the purpose of showing that they were actually overfunded. So there will be a really big argument. So the needs assessment will lead to a really very big argument about what the relative needs are. Certainly there was an exercise about 12, 13 years ago when DFP had an exercise with departments about trying to benchmark their needs on needs in Great Britain. Nothing, to my knowledge, nothing was ever published from that. So if you're in a position whereby you've got limited tax devolution, and if you had a lot of tax devolution, the big question is whether it's actually usable or not. The alternatives in a largely grant-based system are to have the kind of adjustment mechanism that we've got in Barnet, or a needs assessment. If there was a needs assessment, and as some people would argue, Wales is shown to be underfunded and not Scotland and Northern Ireland overfunded, you then have to have a formula to phase in the reduction, because if you suddenly took a big hit, it would have calamitous macroeconomic effects, quite apart from the social effects. So essentially, the practical alternatives are you have a needs-based formula, and then the question arises about who is actually going to do that assessment. Now, my view is that nobody should trust the Treasury to actually do that assessment. If you're actually going to have a needs assessment, you have to have an independent body doing that. There's an obvious example in Australia with the Commonwealth Grants Commission. That's a very big, expensive operation, and it's controversial, very controversial in Australia, but it's remarkably resilient. Alternatively, you have the kind of adjustment mechanism, but the adjustment mechanisms in future got to be much more transparent. Because if you, for example, if the UK government wants to keep reducing the level of public services, and the devolved parliaments don't actually want to do that, and say take Scotland wants to have a higher rate of income tax than in the rest of the UK, the Finance Secretary in Scotland has got to be sure that there is actually no penalty operated through the grant system. So if you're going to use a tax power, and recommend to the Parliament that the rate is higher than the rate that one's expecting in the rest of the United Kingdom, you've got to be sure there is not going to be some backdoor way of actually taking the money away from you. Otherwise, it's completely politically unusable. And that, I think, is the big danger. One of the things about the Scottish referendum was the astonishing turnout. I mean, turnout of 85–86% is really quite incredible in a modern election or referendum. But the expectations have been built up. From that, which are going to be very difficult to manage.
Sure, just one wee point on that there. The needs-based assessments you talk about there, David. How do you think we would do so badly compared to Wales after what we've come from in the last 10, 15 years to where we're at today?
Well, I do not know what will happen. I know what other people say will happen. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Haltom Commission did a quote simple needs assessment, considerably derived on English formula, which showed that Wales was underfunded and Scotland and Northern Ireland were overfunded. Now, the fact it was done by a Welsh Commission makes one perhaps, not terribly surprised that should actually be the result. But the obvious point to make is that I take the member's point about neglect of infrastructure. But the kind of day-to-day expenditure is on things like health and education. One of the things that DFP have done recently is actually do the kind of net fiscal report for Northern Ireland, which is a kind of the same as the same kind of exercise as the government expenditure and revenues in Scotland. And the fact that Scotland's been doing that for a long time has created a much better knowledge base about Scotland's public finances than would otherwise have existed. There are various reasons why that's more difficult to do in Northern Ireland than it is in Scotland. But I think one of the striking things of that report is that I think that the reference year they had, revenue in the UK was covering 80% of the expenditure, and in Northern Ireland 60% of the expenditure. So there's a very big, what it's done is, what I think is quite sensible, is to be quite open about the fiscal transfer to Northern Ireland. There's no point, my view is the better data you've got, the better position you are in to argue.
Just on that point, Paul?
Yeah, it's on the data. I appreciate that we went through a difficult enough time trying to work out what our block grant would be hit for if we went down the route of corporation tax, and Treasury being their usual blackguard, you don't actually know, because they can't exactly tell you what the tax take is on corporation tax in Northern Ireland. How can we have confidence in the data that we are receiving?
I think you've got to distinguish between a reluctance to share what people have got and the actual genuine difficulty. Because when companies do their corporation tax declarations to HMRC, they are not doing it on the basis of dividing the corporation tax between different countries in the different countries in the United Kingdom. So there's a genuine knowledge problem. Also, the minute you actually have a different rate of corporation tax, a different rate of rules within the UK, clearly there's two things happen. One is you start getting better data, but secondly, people have got reasons for locating their profits in the lower tax jurisdiction.
But is there any mechanism that's been brought into place to make it a more transparent process? Because up to now, we just have to accept what has been said.
Well, I honestly don't know what you've been given about the calculations about what the loss in corporation tax were. But there's
a variance of almost 100% between what they say and.
Yeah. But the point I made, I can see that there's a genuine difficulty because there's been no past reason for having such data. I mean, as an aside, if you look at the corporation tax figures in JERS, they're based on economic activity, where the economic activity plays. But that's not how corporation tax works between countries. So it's based on tax residence. It's based on tax residence, which isn't the same thing. So there is a genuine difficulty. But without more transparency, there is not going to be trust in the system. And in that way, I completely understand and agree with your comment.
Okay, Deputy Chair.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Professor.
Morning.
I suppose one might be forgiven for coming to the conclusion that you're slightly sceptical about the transfer of corporation taxing powers to Northern Ireland here, judging from what you've said. But there are a number of points you said in relation to that. You said that there was a danger of long-term legal disputes. Can you clarify what's involved there?
Well, one would have to be very careful you don't fall foul of state aid rules. The key judgment is about the Azores judgment, the European Court of Justice, and basically, in crude non-lawyerly terms, you've got to be able to prove that what you lose by the corporation tax, by having lower corporation tax in revenue, is not fed back to you by the UK government through a back door. Now, given the kind of what I said about Barnett Plus before, I think that might actually really be quite very difficult to prove. And these cases are a habit of running on for a very long time. An analogy, which I think makes the point, is that Birmingham City Council is having to sell a lot of its assets because it's getting an equal pay claim. To settle an equal pay claim that's been mounting up over a very long time, which is now a massive sum. So I think one's got to be careful that you don't pass a lot of future you pass bills to the future in quite a dangerous way. My view, I mean, one of the reasons for my scepticism about whether this will ever happen is that if Scotland got a devolved corporation tax within the United Kingdom, it would be actually much more damaging to the Treasury than Northern Ireland getting it. You think of the size of the Scottish financial sector, and you could imagine that there would be very substantial diversion of tax domicile to Edinburgh. So there is an argument that one understands the frustration that Northern Ireland has about the lower corporation tax in the south, but that was tolerated in a completely different economic climate relative to companies paying corporation tax. One of the dangers is that you can argue that corporation tax is dying internationally. But what is actually happening is, despite the OECD base erosion project, what's happening is countries are actually, since 2008, saying that they're taking this seriously. At the same time is that the kind of UK is leading the race to the bottom in terms of headline rates, and is actually doing things like the patent box. So I think that there is a significant danger that because it was perceived to work in the South 20, 30 years ago, it isn't necessarily going to work. It isn't necessarily going to work here.
And when you said that, I think you said that you had written in an earlier paper, or you had expressed the view anyway, that we were being led up the garden path in relation to transfer of corporation taxing powers. And did you mean that the UK was saving on the block grant and also possibly gaining from the increased income tax and VAT payments which might come from it?
Yeah, wasn't a point in 2003 about arguing be led up the garden path. It was basically I was expecting scepticism about that as the economic development tool in Northern Ireland. My point now is that the time for the corporation tax mechanism has almost certainly now gone. There's the international police. Governments across the world, including the US government, are actually very seriously worried about the collapse of their corporation tax revenues. I mean, the Obama administration has been trying to do something about what's called inversion by US companies. So it's a much bigger international issue. So that what actually happens in countries is monitored much more carefully now than would have been monitored 20 years ago.
Thanks. And I just get on to my question. Is there a case for a neutral regulator between Treasury and the devolved administrations in relation to Barnett?
Well, I mean, in 1976, which was a long time ago, I proposed a territorial exchequer board. That's something that the time has now come. Yes, the direct answer to the question is that because of the past lack of transparency about how the system operates, because of the lack of trust in how the system operates, we need. I'm not sure I'd use the word regulator. We definitely need a body separate away from the Treasury, that actually collects the data and publishes the data. I mean, regulator implies decision making. I'm more sceptical about decisions, but I would want to see the information on which decisions are going to be taken in the public domain.
Some means of objectifying the information.
But as I replied to an earlier question, there are sometimes some things you just don't know. Generally, either the data doesn't exist or conceptually it's very, very difficult to get a measure. But what one does need is some kind of organisation that is actually going to put the numbers in the public domain with access to Treasury information. So it's partly a question of getting inside the government data perimeter. The thing academics can do so much, but there's a limit they can because they don't have access to the information. So you need a body that's like the Office for Budget Responsibility, that's got access to the data, can actually say, right, okay, the best we can do on the information we've got is this. What we could do to get better information is this and that. I think that as soon as you start talking soon as you start talking about having, in the Scottish context, more dependence on your own tax revenues, I think that is absolutely essential. But I say, what I really worry about in the Scottish context is the idea that you've got lots of you're bringing in lots of tax revenues, but you have absolutely no control whatsoever of what is coming in. It's all being driven by UK decisions, and the costs of diverging for the UK in terms of administrative costs and compliance costs and political hassle is just too big.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Peter?
Yes, thank you. I mean, I suppose just on a couple of issues. You've talked about, I mean, obviously there's been a key theme of the transparency, but you've mentioned obviously the position of Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and also where there is a common interest and there's a greater level of leverage in that regard, and that perhaps, if you like, one of the tensions being there between Wales and Scotland in terms of the positions. What do you see as the impact if we look at the flip side of the coin, and you've mentioned obviously the greater levels of disparity within English councils and within some of the regional side of it, but obviously one of the key debates that is ongoing across the water at the moment, largely I think probably as a reaction to the Scottish referendum and some of the promises then that have been made off the back of that, is the idea of either greater autonomy for English regions or English laws for English folks. There seems to be a general range of potential actions, and there's no great consensus there present as to precisely what direction that goes in. What impact, if you like, do you believe that English sensibilities in that regard are going to have as to the development, replacement potentially of the Barnett formula?
I mean, I think that one of the consequences of the first past the post electoral system for Westminster is that one has no idea what's actually going to happen. What's going to happen at Westminster, and because of that, there is a very serious danger that the English votes for English laws is going to disrupt the system quite seriously. When one country is 84% of the whole, there isn't such a thing as an English law. Anything that subsequently is going to affect the funding of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland isn't solely an English matter. So, for example, you could have the introduction of charges, NHS charges in England, which has nothing to do with Scotland, except the fact that Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland get less money as a result of that policy change. And it would, it would presumably be conceivable to try to find some way of literally stripping out certain measures which are entirely organisational matters within England. But I suspect that is not the way that Westminster works, and I cannot see Westminster wanting to change its practices just because of the devolved administration.
Appreciate one level. I suppose there is an issue obviously around. I mean, the issue in one sense is the English laws for English votes for English laws has a probably, at least on the face of it, a greater sort of governance issue in terms of, shall we say, the unity of the UK side of it, rather than a direct financial implication. But given the fact, I suppose, at one level there may well be, from a parliamentary point of view, a degree of resistance to go down that road, is there a danger that an alternative route is looked at, which is leaving aside the pure autonomy of for example, Scotland, that there is then pressure from English MPs to say, well, okay, if we're not in a position to do something entirely about the autonomy of this, the general, if you like, complaint quite often of a lot of English MPs will be, well, actually, there's an awful lot more freedom given to Scotland, but actually worse than that from their point of view, they see per head of population a much greater spend in Scotland. And consequently, if there is a certain level of frustration on the governance side of it, that then flips over with consequences potentially for Northern Ireland into a greater level of fiscal constraint in the sense of less money being given by whatever formula that is there. Your
point about the frustration of English MPs, I completely take. But the problem is because of the asymmetry of population size across.
I understand that.
Yeah,
I think
that's
from that point of
that's
view,
essentially.
whether objectively from outside, therefore it's particularly
Yeah,
justified.
yeah,
It's a
no,
different
but I
question,
accept.
but it's-
Yeah, I accept the point about the frustration. But the difficulty is going to devise a mechanism that doesn't devalue the status of Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland Westminster MPs, that actually basically makes, for example, Scottish MPs not at all interested in Westminster. Now, so that you could, having just had a referendum with a reasonably clear majority for Scotland to stay in the Union, and then completely unadvertised during the referendum campaign, you get restrictions on Scottish MPs. You can imagine how that inflames things.
Yeah.
But yes, if you're asking me if there's a political difficulty because of the acceptability of the funding of devolved administrations to English MPs, or the kind of the fact that Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland have got powers that England hasn't had. But of course, one should remember that when the northeast of England had the opportunity to have such powers, it did not take it. There's great ambiguity about what England wants for itself. The bizarre thing now, as I said earlier, there's been massive cuts in local government expenditure, in England. At the same time that you're getting the city deals for the big cities. So you've got a big withdrawal of resources and then a selective passing back of some of that cuts to particular areas. So the question of what, paradoxically, having settled reasonably what's going to happen in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, one has the problem of what to do with England. And I think that's the kind of fundamental point, and that is actually relevant to the rest of us, because if England is dissatisfied, the sheer population size and representation of England. I mean, I don't know about Northern Ireland, but there's a sense in Scotland, which is certainly shared by parts of England, that the UK is run for the benefit of London and the South East. And that is a very powerful driver in the Scottish referendum campaign. And it was a really very serious problem for the no side of the referendum campaign. That impression was held well beyond the kind of conventional, normally expected yes voters.
Can I ask you just finally, I don't have questions, but obviously in terms of your evidence, I think probably the biggest thing that these grasped is the benefit and need, both from a wider sort of generically sensible position, but also perhaps from a degree of self-interest as a region, the need of the benefit of both knowledge, power and transparency, I think of high level of significance. And that I think that I suspect would be something that certainly you'd find common ground that we'd be pressing for in that regard. And I think that applies both in terms of, without reopening the debate on the corporation tax that has relevance to there, but also particularly to the Barnett formula. You've also, I think, indicated perhaps, shall we say, a note of caution, that whereas there could be justification across the UK for, even if it could be done relatively easily, but I think it can't be, in terms of needs-based analysis, that it may at best be a double-edged sword for us. Whereas that is something that's quite often been trailed in Northern Ireland, there may be an issue of be careful what you wish for, because the belief may well be that you radically change the formula by way of pure needs-based, we may end up getting considerably less money than that. There's at least a risk of that. In terms of advice that outside of those, I suppose, two principal areas, in terms of our approach to any modification of Barnett's, continuation, replacement, or any of those type of things, do you have any other particular advice for us as a region, I suppose, and particularly for us as a EFP committee that's looking into the issue of the Barnett formula as a direction that you feel we should be pushing to go in, or at least where you feel we should simply be holding ground?
Well, I think one of the important things you can do is improve levels of public understanding in Northern Ireland about how it works. I've been trying for more than 30 years in Scotland to improve public understanding, and much of what was said in the referendum suggests that I failed. It's quite remarkable when the former first minister of Scotland doesn't actually know how the formula works. That is not at all encouraging. So I think what you ought to be doing now.
Well, I should say, without being slightly cynical on this, is the question, because obviously, whatever else you say about Alex Salmond, he's somebody who is, I think, would certainly be perceived as somebody who's very intelligent in that regard. Whether he genuinely doesn't understand, or whether
this was not a reference to Alex Salmond. This was reference to a previous First Minister. The two things I would urge is that you actually try and improve the level of public understanding, and that's in political leaps and in the and as I say, you've got to know whether your worries about Barnett is giving you too much money, and hence you're not doing public sector reform, or it's not giving you enough money, and this is creating significant hardship. One obvious point is that we've implicitly talked entirely about the Dell side of the Northern Ireland budget, but clearly there's a potential macroeconomic effect from reductions in welfare. The people talk about growing the private sector, but the private sector depends on the purchasing power of people who work in the public sector and the people on benefits, as well as people who are working in the private sector. So I think the first point is to improve the quality of the public debate, and I think that the linked to that, one just wants more transparency about how the system works. And as I said, you could make a cynical argument that the devolved administrations actually did quite well by all being done reasonably secretly. One of the points I've made several times elsewhere is that it's interesting to note that ever since devolution in 1999, there's been a Scottish MP who's been a cabinet minister in the Treasury. It would be very interesting to see what actually happens if there isn't a Scottish minister in the Treasury, because one of the points is that very significant change to Barnett would actually have big implications for Scotland. So what's tended to happen in Barnett is all sorts of complications have got into the system without the basic principles being eroded.
I'm intrigued, just finally, I suppose, in follow-up with that. Again, I don't think any of us would disagree with the concept of trying to deepen sort of, and having that level of discourse, public understanding of these sort of issues. I guess the cynic might say that unless an issue is read in tooth and claw, and I suspect Northern Ireland's no different from anywhere else, there's quite often a difficulty in necessarily getting everybody to engage in a lot of the minutiae of politics in general, but whenever you get them trying to get people understanding economic formula, whatever general glaze that comes across the eye, whenever it comes in politics, then can be sort of multifold. And I suppose by your own admission, you're saying, well, look, you've been at this more or less for 20 years, and you've maybe had a very limited amount of success in being able to engage that. How do you think we could crack that greater level of deepening public understanding?
I was just going to keep at it. I think keep at it is the crucial point. I mean, there was a long. I mean, it's interesting when I called it the Barnett Formula in 1980. It took about 15 years, 20 years for the government to actually use the term. It was totally resisted. In academic publications, I was using the name Barnett Formula, and other people were using the Barnett Formula, but the government didn't do it. And it was probably around the devolution time that the name actually took off. And to say, to the extent that it appears on the front page of the Daily Record, a few days before the referendum, showed how it had gone up in the public consciousness, but not actually a sufficiently good understanding of what issues the mechanism raised.
Okay, so keep hammering, and then some of it will eventually get through, hopefully. Okay, thank you.
Killa?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Professor Hield. Very interesting presentation. Obviously, within the terms of the Smith Commission, and one of their recommendations would be to strengthen their borrowing powers in Scotland. Would you agree that we should have our borrowing power strengthened here? And what would that look like? And can you give me a brief view on the implications that would have here? And do you have an opinion on the national minimum wage, and should that be reviewed also?
One of the things about borrowing powers, you've always got to ask yourself the question of whether you're actually getting more spending power or whether it's actually getting relabeled. So the question, are you getting Barnet then plus some borrowing power, or is some of what would have been Barnet becoming borrowing powers? And that's an important point. One of the complications I referred to earlier was financial transactions capital, which can only be spent in a restricted way. Clearly, there is a risk in those areas that you actually underspend and lose the money, or you actually spend in less wise ways than you would have done if you'd actually had more control over that spending. So the question about borrowing powers is that the UK Treasury, because of its obligations under European Stability and Growth Pact, has got to control public debt and borrowing, and the UK still has a very significant. UK is still one of the highest borrowing countries as a proportion of GDP in the European Union. Such was the big hit from 2007-8. So whether my question would be that if borrowing powers are the right instrument for what you want to do, yes, take them, but be very careful. It's not just you're not losing flexibility. Because once you lose flexibility, there becomes the danger of you get the double danger of underspend or not spending it wisely. I don't particularly have a view about the minimum wage. One of the things which is very obvious is the labour market is splitting, and various factors are leading to a polarisation of the labour market, with lots of people not far from the minimum wage or 0-hour contracts, and there are obviously disturbing things happening at the bottom of the labour market. It's fascinating. For a long time, talking about inequality was an extremely unfashionable thing to do. It was regarded as a bit left-wingish. What's interesting is that OECD, much of the best work that's been done at the minute is coming from the OECD and the IMF, which are now starting to argue that there's very serious economic damage being done by the growth of inequality. So the kind of, they're not arguing that inequality is necessarily bad on a political values level. They're arguing it's bad because it damages economic performance. So the whole question of what's happening at the lower part of the labour market, which is presumably to do with globalisation of the economy, the possibility of offshoring jobs, the decline of union densities, and so on. But so yes, I don't regard this as it's not a public finance matter in the sense of what we've been talking about, but in terms of context, it also creates an issue about the interface between what you can earn in the labour market and what you get in benefits. The kind of one of the things that worries me about Scotland is the standard presumption that if we have welfare devolution, our benefits will be higher. Leaving aside the question about how you pay for them, that takes away the fact that you've got this problem of the interface between the labour market and the benefit system.
Very good, thank you.
Okay, John.
Thanks, Chair. Probably just a couple of things to pick up. I'm sorry I missed the start of your presentation. Round what your discussion with Michaela there around borrowing power. Will borrowing powers become more essential the more taxes you devolve to a region, in that you would need necessarily that flexibility if we have corporation tax here and tax receipts go down, you could be left and for the national government easily does that. We were supposed to be a balanced budget, but now we're 98 billion and still in debt. Will that become more important the more taxes you devolve?
Yes, I answered the previous question with reference to capital. Yes,
Yeah.
but you're absolutely right. That the more you are dependent on your own revenue, particularly if your own revenue is largely driven by what happens at the UK level in terms of policy and the UK macroeconomic risks, you obviously need borrowing power for smoothing purposes. Yes. You know, otherwise you would have sudden public expenditure cuts. One of the points I didn't make about Barnett is that it gives the finance ministries of the devolved administrations a degree of stability, degree of predictability about what the budget is going to be. We've lost that to some extent because the spending review 2013, for political reasons, only covered 1 year. Because the coalition couldn't agree to do it beyond the year that was going to start around the 15, but beyond the 15-16 year. But yes. If you are subject to the revenue volatility from, in Scotland case, income tax, or in Northern Ireland case, corporation tax, you must have the borrowing capacity to offset shortfalls, and the saving capacity to actually park your money, so you don't have to surrender it. You've got to be able to park a surplus in the good years to which you pay in the bad years. But yes, the design of that will be really quite important.
The other point, just to bring you back to, I mean, my two concerns even in our debate around corporation tax have been the volatility of it, which the borrowing ties into, and also the economic data. Been a lot of questions around the reliability, or indeed even that it tends to be several years out of date at the time you're doing. So we would even have a job to do to catch up on the economic data.
Yeah, I mean, the quite a long time ago, an economist in the Northern Ireland government pointed out to me the difference between Scotland and Northern Ireland. Scotland is a much more self-contained economy. There's been a long tradition of pretty good economic statistics about Scotland. Northern Ireland is a much less self-contained economy. It's got a long land border with a member of the Eurozone. So it's a much more difficult. It's smaller. It's more difficult to map. The smaller a geographical area you go to, and the more interconnected it is, the more difficult it is to get reliable economic statistics. So yes, I mean, clearly one needs better economic data, but one shouldn't not recognise that there is actually a practical difficulty because of the nature of the economy and its interfaces with the South.
Well, on the wider Barnett bit, have we? I mean, there's probably, you know, you've mentioned a few times about, you know, the devolved regions and nations doing quite well, or well, apart from the Welsh maybe. But I mean, that's probably a thing that you end up, if you're doing well out of anything, it's probably a case of keeping your head down and not making too much of a fuss about. Has Northern Ireland managed to do that, mainly because it's quite a small part of the UK in economic terms, you know? So the money, I think our last presentation is, they reckon we were getting what, 30% above the spend in England, with a relative need maybe somewhere between 14 and 20% of England. So if you move to needs based, we would take a fair hit to the block grant.
Yeah, I mean, on those numbers, yes. One of the things that for about 20 years I've been trying to get is that I've been trying to get the right numbers from the Treasury for what the level of spending in each of the devolved administration is relative to what is spent in England on those same services, because people overuse the data in public expenditure statistical analyses, which covers things which are not within the Barnett system. But if you had my guess would be that if those numbers that you quoted held up, there is going to be a difficult adjustment period, But so one of the questions would be is that if for example, on your numbers, it was decided that Northern Ireland was overfunded, and that's obviously going to be disputed, you would actually have to have a period of time whereby you converged on where it should be. You can't suddenly, except with enormous disruptive political, social, economic consequences, suddenly kind of cut the budget. So you need to phase in what you do. But as I say, I think that there will be very significant difficulties in doing a needs assessment. My favourite example is that when the Labour government did the needs assessment in 1978, in a view to when devolution was going to happen then, published later in the Treasury Needs Assessment Study, it refused to allow the fact that Wales had 2 languages to be a needs indicator. So the additional costs of Welsh was not actually a needs indicator, which just shows how matter of political judgment.
Do we put ideas in people's heads?
Yeah, it just shows how judgmental the question is about what is actually a needs indicator.
Well, round your other point, England makes up, what, 84% of the UK effectively. And pressure on England on saying that we one of the most centralised systems of government, and pressure for like English city regions, if you like, and what you might want to devolve to them or require them to do. This, you know, Manchester, Birmingham, you know, and driving economies in the north of England. Parts of the north of England have a pretty high dependence on public sector as well. So that argument that most things seem to be driven for London and the south east probably, you know, makes sense for a lot of people across the UK. Where do you see that debate going, and is that not also going to put pressure on where Barnett ends up with, or will we move to a needs-based assessment, or if we stick with Barnett, will it not put pressure on that if parts of England go down this road to really try and rejuvenate, particularly the north of England?
My personal view is that much of the talk of localism in England is just political rhetoric. Parts of England have suffered enormous public spending cuts, so the counter rhetoric is about localism and, you know, city deals and special things for Manchester. But if you take the kind of hits that Newcastle has taken, for example, has taken, so I think to repeat something I said earlier, I think the real political problem we've got in the UK is what to do with England, because England doesn't know what it wants. There is the resentment of the perception that things are done for the benefit of London and the South East. Yet there aren't identifiable political units to which you can have the kind of devolution that Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland has. Whether better managed, the John Prescott regional reforms in England might have taken hold is I think, arguable, but I think that's just completely off the political agenda. And what I worry about localism in England is it basically means devolving functions without giving you the money to pay for it. The classic one is a localisation of council tax benefit in England, whereby the existing spending on council tax, the council got that minus 10%, transferring the burden of poverty relief, not from the central taxpayer to the local taxpayer. So the question about what happens in England becomes fundamentally important, because if England is dissatisfied, some of that dissatisfaction it comes out in terms of hostility towards the devolved parts of the United Kingdom. But I think that crucially, there is a for the whole of the UK, there's a very serious economic problem. I mean, a thought experiment actually helps. Now the southeast of England and London is doing incredibly well. There is a temptation now for people to want to keep what you kill. So there's increasing pressure for people to keep their tax revenues, particularly London wanting to keep its tax revenues. But if you think as a thought experiment, what would have happened if the UK government hadn't backed the financial sector in 2008 and let the financial sector collapse? That would have had devastating consequences for London and the South East, because it just shows that the rest of the United Kingdom actually was underwriting London and the South East at that particular time.
I mean, Chair, probably over all of these in the the UK, on the back of all of this debate and Scottish referendum, it is going to be, look quite differently over the next number of years between pressures that will come on Barnet, tax-bearing powers being devolved to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, albeit different powers and different abilities to move. Will that also does that also mean that naturally things like the minimum wage might need to be different? We mightn't have a national minimum wage, we might have a more regionalised minimum wage. We might look at things like one of the issues even around tax credit system. I think we use about 14% of our welfare spend on tax credit. Are we effectively subsidising business and poor pay at that point? But do you see all of those things actually diverging in the way the UK is headed?
You're raising a really big issue, because I think that people have a different view about cash benefits than they have about public services. There is much more support for and acceptance of having things like education and health run by a more local political jurisdiction. But there is, rightly or wrongly, a view that old age pensions, for example, and welfare benefits ought to be the same across the UK. There will be some free market economists who would like to reduce benefits in, not necessarily pensions, but reduce benefits in lower wage areas. But as I mentioned earlier, that could have significant macroeconomic effects on the lower income areas. So, but I do think there's a kind of psychological view that cash is different from services, and it's not. I don't think that's just a UK thing. I think there is across the world. A belief that this is part of what in the current jargon is part of the social union of the UK, and I think that kind of trying to change that might be quite difficult. Obviously, if you're in a low wage economy, it creates issues that don't apply in a high wage economy. So that's I think a political judgment.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. In terms of Revenue Scotland has now been established as the first tax collection system specifically for Scotland, I think, in 300 years, or how it's marketed. Is that something we should look at here? Obviously, there's, in terms of the debate of devolving fiscal powers, there's always the argument about fiscal costs. So we can set a tax rate, but do we want the administration costs of that too? Is that something that would be a benefit in terms of Wales, in terms of here, as well as Scotland?
Well, the Revenue Scotland had the advantage when it started that the stamp duty land tax on the UK level was just so stupid that clearly having that tax devolved, you could actually try to get a more sensible structure for it. In terms of more important taxes, in terms of money, the question becomes about whether you use the HMRC. Now, there's two issues. One would assume that there are substantial economies of scale operating at HMRC level at the UK that you would lose if you tried to separate it out for Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. There's also the question of access to data. So I think without access to data, being within the UK government perimeter, you could actually have difficulty. One of the arguments running in Scotland at the minute is whether HMRC ought to have access to health records to establish where people lived for their declarations of Scottish taxpayer. I mean, it's never mattered in the UK whether I was regarded as an English taxpayer or a Scottish taxpayer. It now matters. And the question of deciding where people actually live, and going beyond the self-declaration, is potentially an important issue. And the question about what kind of access would a devolved tax administration have to the records of the UK government. I've always argued that one should keep using HMRC. I think that breaking up within, obviously if Scotland was independent, that's quite different. But within the UK, I see no advantages in breaking it up. But having Revenue Scotland to manage these pretty small local taxes, where there might be information advantages in being local, is I think different.
So in terms of here, what if we were to get further powers over the next 2 to 3 years? Would setting up such a commission, such an organisation, be a benefit? Even, we were talking about corporation tax earlier. Would there be a benefit in terms of that? Yes, you're right in terms of whether we have the correct information, but the establishment of such an organisation would perhaps back up an argument for further transparency and for further information to come from Treasury.
But I think the difficulty would be that your local administration would not have the access that HMRC has got. So I mean that would be there would clearly be a role for DFP on the policy side, but given the fact that a lot of companies paying Northern Ireland corporation tax would also be paying UK corporation tax as well for their operations outside Northern Ireland. I think you would have to be very careful losing the economies of scale and expertise of HMRC.
Martin, final question.
Thank you, Chair. Just to finish up, I am baffled by the fact that we're told by London that all these systems are of huge benefit to us, but we can't get the exact data for some reason. So trust and transparency board. But that's not what I want to ask. I'm only on this committee, so remind me about the Olympics, because you mentioned the Olympics earlier on, and everyone else smiled. But remind me what happened in terms of Barnett in the Olympics.
Well, the point about the Olympics is you have to decide which expenditure in England is actually comparable for purposes of the Barnett formula. One thing the UK government can do is argue this expenditure might take place in England, like East End of London, but it's for the benefit of the UK as a whole, in this way that defence and foreign affairs and overseas aid is for the benefit of the UK as a whole. So the big argument was what part of the total Olympics budget was actually solely for the benefit of England, London, and what was for the benefit of the UK as a whole, because it was going to raise the UK profile internationally. There was a big row about that between the devolved administrations and the Treasury, because a lot of things which Treasury ministers went round saying this is wonderful for reconstruction and development of East London. They were saying that in public, and then in private they were saying it's nothing to do with England, it's all to do with the UK. There was eventually a deal. The devolved administrations got a small amount of money in the end. It was a kind of, I think Alan Trench gave evidence on this quite recently. They actually did a deal. There was a bit of compensation. But it's a good example. It's a good example of the question about who actually decides what is Barnett comparable and what isn't Barnett comparable. And as I said earlier, my view, and it wouldn't be shared by all academics by any means, my view is on the whole the Treasury have played it reasonably honest since devolution. But I think that once you start having significant tax powers, you cannot rely on it being played reasonably honest. You do need the numbers in the pocket of men.
Just to work that through, so what did the Olympics cost? 3 billion or 2 billion? Or
I also don't know.
Billions?
Bigger number, I think.
Okay, bigger. So how was that reflected in our...
Well, you got there were parts of the Olympics expenditure that the consequentials were allowed for, but there was some that wasn't allowed for, and then there was some kind of settlement. How big this? How big this?
Really big 50-meter pool in Bangor.
Yeah. How big the settlement was? How big the settlement was in relation to what should have come in the first place?
But in terms of then our annual budget, I mean, you mentioned the word defence. I know that Mr. Cameron's going to spend 3 billion on new aircraft carrier. He wants to spend 20 billion on new fighter jets. Surely he isn't suggesting that we're paying for some of that as well, are we?
No, well, it's not. But that's a good example of what's not comparable. Okay. that is not, because that is not expenditure for the benefit of England. That's expenditure for the benefit of the UK.
Well, I'm arguing exactly the opposite. No, I'm quite happy. He should take that. I don't want a second aircraft carrier. One's quite enough for Mr. Conrad. I certainly don't want his new generation of fighter jets. So, but he's not really saying to people here we should bear the brunt for that. There's no money for schools. But
well, look, it's been paid out of UK taxes to which you contribute.
Okay, thank you.
Professor, you've been more than generous with your time. Can I thank you on behalf of the committee?
Thank you very much.
And your contribution will go towards our report.
And the best wishes for your report.
Thank you.
She had lovely notes.
Members, moving on to the budget and savings delivery plan. Can I refer members to the CFP briefing paper at pages 21 to 31. Morning.
Morning.
Rita, do you want to make some opening comments and then we'll go into it?
Okay. Thanks, Chair. You've received a copy of our savings delivery plan, and that outlines the measures that we are intending to implement to deliver the £25 million worth of savings that we require in order to live within our budget allocation in 2015-16. The departmental board has developed an action plan that underpins the savings delivery plan and has assigned project owners to each of the various measures that need to be implemented. The project owners are currently working on developing specific project plans in order to implement the required reductions. This process will set the target level of savings required under each measure because, as you can see, we've obviously set a range of potential savings under each measure at the moment. I think it's fair to say that we shouldn't underestimate the scale of the challenge that the department's facing next year. Only 20% of our costs can be regarded as potentially discretionary, and we're trying to take a cut of nearly 10% out of this. We do expect to deliver some of the reductions through reducing the 45% of our budget that's spent on salaries. And in line with the rest of the NICS, we've already set in place a process whereby all vacancy filling requires permanent secretary approval. However, we will still be dependent on the voluntary exit scheme to deliver around 10% of the savings that we're intending to do in 15-16. So as I said, the paper gives you a flavour of some of the actions we need to take, but the position is still changing. Preeta and I are in the middle of a tour of the department where we're meeting all of the directors to better understand the issues that they're facing in relation to their budget allocations, and as a result of that I'm expecting to do the first of a number of iterations that we will need to continually do to review the position in line with what we think can be delivered. So it's both a moving position as well as a challenging position, and I think an interesting year ahead for us anyway.
Interesting or challenging?
Both, I think.
In terms of the rationalisation of the office estate, is there a precise time frame for the rationalisation and reduction in lease costs, and what are the specific target savings for that reduction?
We're still working on the plan at the moment as to how that programme of work will roll out. We have, as you're aware, made a number of significant purchases of property from the money that was allocated to the department in 14-15, and we do expect that the savings from that will come to fruition in 15-16. So there's around £2 to £3 million worth of savings to come from the work that we've done this year, assuming all of the offers that we've had accepted go through to completion. I'm touching wood. So we would expect that the actions that are taken in 15-16 probably won't bear fruit in terms of savings until future budget years, but that there will obviously be opportunities there to rationalise space and to free up leases in future years.
Given the committee's work in terms of our flexible working inquiry, and also, I mean, the finding the committee came to was that there was considerable scope for consolidation of the civil service estate, with only about 20% meeting space utilisation targets. So what is the department's position in terms of meeting specific space utilisation targets? Because as far as some of us are concerned, there's a lot of opportunity there to make savings that need to be made.
Yeah, and we do continue to make progress against those targets. I mean, our business plan this year, I know, had a target to fit out, and I can't remember off the top of my head how many metres squared we were to vacate and how many workstations we were to fit out to workplace NI standards. And our business plan for next year will contain a similar target, although we haven't set what that target will be yet. There obviously are constraints on the speed which we can move on these things, because to reconfigure an office to make better use of space does require capital investment. In some cases, that capital investment is relatively minor. It's maybe new desks that are smaller, or it's knocking down a partition wall. In other cases, it's a major fit-out cost to refit a building. You will have seen in our capital plans that we're planning to spend, I think it's some 8.6 million of our capital budget for 15-16 on office refurbishments that will enable us to meet those objectives and drive savings from 16-17 onwards.
And just to follow through on that, in terms of working from home, flexible working, you know, that there does seem to be a resistance within the department, and that was certainly evident during our inquiry. Is that something that the department is going to pursue? Because, you know, the less people that you need physically in at work, the less space you need, and the less cost to the taxpayer.
I'm afraid I don't know. I don't have that information to hand today. It's not directly my area of work. There's no firm plans for space reduction in 15-16 as a result of that. Is the only thing that I can say, but I don't know where that piece of work is at the moment.
But is that something that could be looked at? Because in terms of savings delivery, I think
I can certainly undertake to come back to the committee on that point.
Adrian?
Thanks, Chair. But you're going to make 25 million of savings this year, and I find it hard to believe that there's going to be no impact to frontline service while you're doing that there. You know, on the table it shows there's no impact there anywhere at all.
Yeah. Well, that's no impact on frontline services, which is a relatively small area for DFP. I mean, most of what we do is delivering services to other government departments, so we're not claiming that there will be no impact on our services to other government departments. I think that there will be impacts in that area, but what we are saying is that we will, at this stage, we hope to be able to shield impacts on the areas that are public facing within DFP, and as I say, that's largely because they are quite small compared to the department as a whole.
That answers the question.
Paul?
Just on, and I'm just looking at the reducing of the maintenance expenditure. I appreciate that the lower amount being 5.5 million and the higher amount being 9.5. If we go down this route, are we pushing a wheelbarrow of a major maintenance bill coming in the future?
Well, we've been very clear that this reduction we would not see as an ongoing reduction. We would see this as a one-off reduction in 15-16 only. It's there because the timing of the voluntary exit scheme, as you're probably aware, means that we won't realise a full year's worth of savings from staff exiting under that scheme in 15-16. So we've had to look to see what can we do quickly and in the short term to plug the gap. So what we're suggesting is that this would see a significant reduction in our maintenance spend for 1 year only, and that we would use the additional savings that we will gain from a full year of staff savings from the people who leave under voluntary exit to make sure that the maintenance budget is returned to its previous levels in 16-17. That's the plan.
Okay, appreciate that.
In terms of shared services, what savings have been realised by DFP as a result of this to date?
I'm not sure I have those figures with me today. I'm afraid, in terms of the historic savings realisation, in fact, I don't have the figures with me, and that's certainly something we can provide. Yes.
And what is the rest of the shared services initiative will simply transfer costs from one public sector organisation to another?
I don't believe that to be the case, but as I say, I can certainly provide you with the details of the savings that have been realised from those projects.
In terms of the voluntary exit scheme, and the specifics are still being worked out across the various departments, what is the basis for the anticipated figure for savings generated in here?
I have based it on staff leaving on average at the 31st of December 2015. I understand that there's going to be a number of tranches under which staff are going to exit that will take place, I think, between September and March. So I've basically assumed that on average we will save 3 months worth of salary in 15-16 for those staff that we've identified, or sorry, for those posts that we've identified will be reduced as a result of the voluntary exit scheme.
And in terms of the department's position that there be a neutral equality impact as a result of the voluntary exit schemes, how can you be assured of that? Because you don't know, for example, the gender makeup of those that will be leaving. Certainly there needs to be safeguards put in place to ensure that there isn't a disproportionate impact on gender, religion, race or whatever.
I mean, my understanding is that there will need the voluntary exit scheme itself will obviously need to undergo appropriate equality assessments, so that there will be appropriate measures put in place as part of it to address any equality issues.
Okay. Members, any other questions? Good.
Yeah, just briefly, I wonder if you could touch on, in the report, I think on R204, you talk about the internal audit work that's ongoing.
Oh, right, yes, sorry.
And as part of that, then obviously, you're given a sort of status of... What's it?
That's the next.
Sorry, I didn't know, you're just taking the whole...
Well, we're moving on to the next session anyway, so...
Okay, I mean...
Sorry, I didn't know whatever. No, I mean, just obviously, you take the availability to answer the particular question, Rachel, but I'm just wondering if you give us a little bit of update on where that's at. I know you've got a green status, but from the point of view of what areas that's going to be covering and sort of what level of information we're likely to get arising out of that in terms of the...
Okay, well, every year the Internal Audit Unit will set out an audit plan for the year that will cover all areas of the department in terms of making sure that those areas of risk are audited and that's addressed. They would develop usually a 3 to 4 year strategic plan that the annual plan then is based on, so that there maybe be areas which are not sufficiently risky to require an audit every year, but that maybe require an audit every other year or every 3 years, and the audit strategy will set that out. Those plans are then agreed with the various directors and with the accounting officer to ensure that they're comfortable that the areas of risk within their business areas are being covered. And then throughout the year, internal audit reports are issued to management to enable them to then take appropriate action to address any control issues that have been identified.
Okay. In terms of the recommendations or the division targets that were amber,
yes.
I think it's R101 on page 34
yes.
Of PACS. Support business areas to manage and monitor budgets to avoid overspend and manage underspend within less than 1.5%. What's the reason for the amber status, and how can we be assured that this will improve in the next financial year?
We're always very nervous, I suppose, about our budget management, and whilst I think in the current year we now have no prospect, I don't think, of an overspend. I do think we've managed those issues away again. I touch wood. But there's a lot of volatility in our budget, in particular around income generation. As you know, we do receive significant income from registration, and I mean, again, the property market is always difficult to predict. It's always hard to know how much money is going to come in from that coming up to the end of the year. So I would always be very reluctant to reduce the status below amber until we're getting towards the end of March, early April, and preliminary figures are starting to emerge, and I can see how the department is actually turning out. So I suppose it reflects a degree of nervousness on my part rather than any particular higher level of risk this year than in any other year. Oh yes, yes. And as Preeta says, we have particular risks around the capital budget this year with the large purchases that we're undertaking, and if any of those should happen to fall through, we would then have a large underspend. Although they're again, touching wood, they're again progressing to plan, and I'm not expecting a large underspend in that area at the moment.
In terms of next financial year, do we expect things to be better, given that there's a number of issues that come up this year in terms of the budget across all the departments? Should next year these targets be met?
I don't expect to have an underspend next year. In fact, if I'm sitting here worrying about an underspend this time next year, I think that'll be a bit of a result. I don't think it's possible to overstate the challenge that we're facing next year in terms of living within our means. I certainly think this target will start off as red at the start of next year, and as I say, the focus I think will move away from an underspend target and towards a just, let's try and save as much as we possibly can. And if that brings us in with an underspend of more than 1.5%, well, I'll probably fall off my chair. But secondly, I think, it will be of advantage to the block as a whole if we can deliver more than £25 million worth of savings. I'm sure there'll be people who'll be well able to spend it.
And I mean, in terms of, you touch on a very important point. In terms of the challenges for the year ahead, how are you going to manage staff morale? I mean, obviously, with people availing of the voluntary exit scheme, it'll put a lot of pressure on staff.
It will. I mean, we have been, myself and the Director of HR have been, I suppose, alerting to the board to the need to plan for what their organisations will look like post-voluntary exit scheme, so that we can move to redeploy people into those posts where people have left under the voluntary exit scheme, but that work still needs to continue. And that's really having firm plans as to which posts we need to go will help us then when people leave under the voluntary exit scheme. They're obviously not going to leave from the posts that we feel need to be lost, but at least if I've identified those posts that can go and those posts that need to stay, that will inform a redeployment pattern. And I think that's probably the best we can do in terms of managing the disruption, because there will be significant disruption as a result of the large change that we're going to be trying to undertake next year. I think the morale question is a more difficult one. I suppose we are at least aware of the need to try and do what we can to manage that issue, but to what extent it's going to be possible, I think we need to be realistic about that as well, and to manage the expectations of staff in terms of what will and will not be possible as part of the exit scheme.
Okay, Michaela?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just staying on the targets. In terms of R104, which is the green status, can you give us more detail on the purpose of that review and the test drill and exercises that were involved, and in terms of any issues identified coming out of that review, and have there been any lessons that you've learned, that the department's learned from?
I mean, this is part of our control framework in the department, so that business areas have delegated authority to approve business cases themselves under 250,000. Anything over 250,000 does require review by Finance Division, by the departmental economist, and then there are limits above which we then have to refer business cases for review by supply. So this is really the process by which we would ensure that those business cases are reviewed and amended where appropriate to make sure that they are fully documenting our decision-making process. The test drilling then, again, is a requirement of supply that we would perform an annual test drill so that we are also looking at a random sample of those business cases that are below £250,000. So it's ones that haven't had to come to us for approval.
Right.
So that just, I suppose, just makes sure that we are checking that business areas are undertaking their obligations on those business cases below the £250,000 threshold. There usually are lessons learned coming out of that, and we would then write to business areas and let them know what those lessons are. So far, they haven't been of significance in that we haven't found that the lessons that could be learned would have changed the decisions that have been made. They're more around how those decisions are documented.
Would they have been around procurement, or what kind of areas would they have been around?
I can't actually remember off the top of my head, I'm afraid.
Okay, no, that's fine. Just to move on to the R105, which is a green status also, can you give us any more detail on the level of compliance by each business area within the terms of the policy, in terms of current level of departmental consultancy spend?
Yes.
Including spend awarded through direct award contracts?
Well, we, in Finance Division, we would monitor all spend that's being put through a consultancy account code, and if there's spend there, that we would also keep a register of those consultancies that have been approved through the appropriate channels. So if we do spot something being coded to a consultancy code that hasn't had an appropriate been through the appropriate approval process, we would then be able to contact that business area and make them aware, make them aware of the requirements, and if necessary, seek retrospective approval. I am happy to report that we find very little of that happening, and actually normally what happens is we find that they've coded it to consultancy when it's not actually consultancy, and it should have actually been coded somewhere else. So we actually have a very high level of compliance, and I've no reason to believe at the moment that there's anything that we have that is not complying with guidance.
And would there be any future risk of increase in consultancy spend arising from any potential reduction in, say, for example, specialist experienced staff through the voluntary exit scheme?
Well,
that's something you've looked at.
It is something that we'll need to consider, but where we bring in external expertise under what's known as a managed service contract, that wouldn't necessarily be classed as external consultancy. So there's quite a narrow definition as what would be classified as external consultancy in terms of a specific one-off piece of work that's maybe informing the strategic direction of the department. So if we were, for example, to lose specialist legal skills, just to take a random example, as a result of voluntary exit, if we were then to undertake a contract with a firm of solicitors, say, to provide that level of support, that wouldn't necessarily be classified as external consultancy. It may be a managed service contract. So I suppose yes and no is the answer to your question.
But I suppose there's a realisation where savings can be made in this as well.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly part of our internal review, as well as identifying the savings that could be delivered in 15-16, we also identified a number of measures that we need to take action in 15-16 in order to deliver savings in 16-17 and beyond. And one of those was an element of benchmarking or market comparison with some of the services that we perform in-house against those services that are performed, similar services that could be brought in externally. That's a piece of work that will take some time to do, but I think there's a number of things that could come out of that. We could determine that it would be more cost effective to outsource some services. We could also learn some lessons as to how our own services could be run more efficiently as part of that. So certainly our plans there to look into that.
Obviously good governance would apply there, and it would be imperative that that's something that should be done kind of as soon as it's possible to do.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Adrian?
Thanks, Chair. Can I ask you about C1.02 as the around the support of the business areas and the county NI system? This has been given an amber status. Can you shed any more light on that, Bridget?
C1.2.
Yes.
Yes.
02, yeah.
That's really there because we did experience a dip in our prompt payment performance in Q1 of the current year. So it's currently running about 2% lower this year than it was last year. So that's why we've highlighted that as amber, although we are still running at 96% for 30-day prompt payment and 91% for 10-day prompt payment, but that does compare to something like 98% last year and 92% this year. So we did want to just make sure that the focus is kept on that area in order to get
Do you think the
performance
focus has
back
slipped
up.
a wee bit? Or what's the reason?
There was a particular issue. We have a particular system called the Works Order Processing System in DFP, which it processes all of our construction invoices. And there was a particular issue around that system in the first quarter of this year. And it does process I can't remember off the top of my head what the percentage of our invoices is, but it's a very significant percentage. So we do have a situation where if that interface is working, our prompt payment is really good. And if it isn't working, our prompt payment takes a dip. So there was a particular issue with that system, which has now been resolved. But we want to keep the focus on that so that we can drive our performance through the rest of the year to try and keep that percentage
Because
as
we're
high
not
as
on the
possible.
fact that has then on down the lane till contractors and subcontractors and all.
Yeah.
Is really important, and it's important that whatever system has broken down.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, I think to put that in context, I think even when we were doing what we regard as badly, we were still up in the 80s%. You know, so I think what we regard as bad performance wouldn't necessarily be bad performance when compared to some other organisations.
Accept the argument for that. Okay, Chair.
Thanks, Adrian. Just there's correspondence. No problem. Any other questions? Okay, members. Prita, Bridget, thank you both very much again.
Thank you.
Glad you have a hit there. Okay, members, time's moving on. In terms of the research briefing, are members content that we put this back until next week?
Yep.
Agreed. Correspondence, Jim?
Okay, Chair, there's 5 items of correspondence. The first 2 items I think are just for noting. There's correspondence from the Oma Enterprise, for a response from DFP to the proposal that Oma Enterprise presented to the committee in terms of remote working facilities. It's just to seek agreement to forward that to Oma Enterprise for information, Chair. Then there's correspondence at page 79 to 80 of the PAC OFM DFM committee writing in relation to European priorities. This will form a substantive item on the agenda because the committee needs to consider a response to that committee. So it's for noting in the meantime. Also then finally there's correspondence at page 81 of the PAC. It's from an individual writing via the Assembly Executive and Review Committee for an update in relation to the issue of equal pay settlement for former NIO and PSNI staff. It's been the correspondence has been relayed to this committee and to the Justice Committee. So it's really just to see if members want to seek an update from the department on that in that regard.
Chair.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just in terms of the Oma Enterprise letter or the department's letter on page 77, the department are indicating they will look for further opportunities to expand facilities within the existing office estate, but are no more specific than that. Are members content with send a follow-up letter just to try and tease out a bit of detail in that regard? Okay. Okay, members, draft work programme pages 84 to 88. Can I seek agreement that in order to inform the committee of future scrutiny of corporation tax issues, that the committee commissions Assembly Research to prepare a paper on the main provisions and key considerations of the passage of the legislation in Westminster. Agreed? Any other business? Next meeting Wednesday the 18th at 10.